Hello, and welcome to On Becoming a Healer. In my time as a doctor, I've worked with plenty of leaders I respected, plenty I thought were just ridiculous, and a good number who inspired me despite their flaws. What are the implications of bad leadership for medicine? What is bad leadership? How bad is it? How common is it? So that's what we're going to talk about today with my co-host, Saul. Hi, Saul.
Hi, Stefan.
Well, you picked this topic. Tell me a little bit about why we'd like to talk about bad leadership in medicine.
So, as you know, Stefan, over the course of my, at this point, getting to be a very long career, I've had a lot of opportunities to work for leaders at almost every level within the academic sphere, at multiple institutions, ranging from, as an intern, your leader is your resident, right? And I've worked for division heads, and I've worked for department heads, and I've worked for deans, and for provosts. And one of the things that I have experienced has been the sort of shock of finding that the person I'm working for is not what I had hoped. You know, when you walk into airports, you see all of these books about how to be a great leader, and it's a popular airport book selling topic for all these business people. I think it's more impactful to talk about bad leadership. Actually, I was looking at the literature, and one of the scholars I came across is a scholar named Robert Hogan, who spent his life really studying bad leadership and looking at ways in which we can identify it and predict it. And bad leadership is not just unique to healthcare. It's in fact, according to Hogan and other scholars, about 50% of people leave a job because of a bad boss. 65 to 75% of leaders in the research that he's done are considered to be incompetent, and he's including managers in that. So it's an incredibly important problem in all organizations. And one of the things about healthcare is that healthcare is ultimately supposed to be about healing, about creating a culture where people can grow and become supporters of other people. And in fact,
Yeah,
that's kind of what being a
yeah.
doctor is. And so there's something ironic and particularly disturbing to me when the toxic leader or the deeply problematic leader is a leader within a healthcare environment and a medical school. It strikes me as particularly discordant. So that's why I wanted to have this conversation today, because we've talked so much about how we're trying to create a healthy environment for people to become physicians who are capable of caring for others, of being
Uh-huh.
nurturing. And if the environment in which they're in lacks those characteristics, which often starts at the top, that's something I think that's worth talking about.
As you were speaking, I had almost an image of Wizard of Oz where they go behind the curtain and they see that the wizard behind the curtain is really not somebody very impressive at all. And it sounds almost like you've had a little bit of the Dorothy Wizard of Oz experience here, that you've gone behind the curtain, perhaps more than I have.
I think one of the key points here is until you work for someone, you don't really see what they're like. And so a lot of these people are charismatic, and they
Yeah.
just come across positively. They present themselves positively. They win you over in one way or another. But then when you start working for them, it's like, oh my God, and you start to realize that there's just a disconnect between who you thought you were going to be working for and what you actually are working for. And I think that's what I'm referring to.
So I'm incredibly intrigued by the question of charisma, but let's come back to that in a moment. And let's talk about a few examples of situations that you've come across where you suddenly realized, oh my goodness, I'm in a whole different world than I thought I was.
Right. So over the years, I have kept a diary. And so I have quite a few examples because I don't want to be accused of libel. I'm going to not refer to the specific titles that these people have. In some
Good.
cases, I won't even refer to their gender. And, it's really not important, of course, anyway. I will say that I am drawing from people at every level you can imagine. As I said, I've had this unusual career where I've worked
And
for
multiple
people, yeah, and
institutions.
up to the highest levels of the institution.
Okay.
And another thing that surprised me along this long journey, 30-year journey, is that they don't get better as you move up. That, I'd always assumed, well, if somebody was a
You
you know,
should rise to the
provost or a
top if you're the
chancellor,
best.
no, they're no less likely to be bad leaders than
Got
people
it.
at a lower level. So when I'm telling these stories, you know, in a sense, it doesn't really matter whether I'm telling a story about somebody at the very highest levels or someone very low down, because I've just seen this type of thing at all levels. So now, as I said, I had an oh my God list of stuff that I wrote down over the years working for various people. And quite honestly, some of these are quite funny now. They didn't feel so funny at the time. And I would say that they were more symptoms of the more serious underlying issues, which I think is what we'll have to talk about. But I do think it's worth kind of sharing the kind of, oh
Yeah.
my God, things that I had.
Let's
Um,
dive into oh my God.
all right. So buckle up. Okay, I remember working for one person who was actually quite senior. I'll say that this person had a budget in the tens of millions, and actually even more than that. They had a big, big budget, and this person was such a control freak that they wanted me to email them when I needed to replace my printer cartridge. And
That is an
I
oh my
would,
God.
yeah, I would email this person and say, may I have another new printer cartridge? And they would write back, yes, you may. Okay, so that was literally, and so anyway, but again, you know, that alone is just funny, right? But think about what that represents and what else could be
Okay.
going on with that
Okay.
individual. We'll get to that
Trying to put
later.
on my serious hat, but
Yeah,
okay,
yeah. Okay, so we'll
continue.
get to that later. I worked for somebody who fired their chief of staff via email. It's not that they fired them by email, but they CC'd all of their subordinates and on this firing email and said, turn over all your responsibilities to these subordinates. And that's how they notified this
That
person
they were
that they were
terminated. So it's just
that they were
cruelty,
terminated.
or
Yes.
it would strike most of us as cruel to do that. You should just talk to them privately, etc.
Yes, and again, I want to be getting people to think about what else this person is also capable of and is probably
Yeah.
doing, just to get to that. I recall working for somebody who got angry with me because I wouldn't sign on to something that they wanted to do that I didn't think was right. They wanted their staff to sign a document saying they agreed to it, and as a result, this person refused to speak with me or meet with me for about 6 to 9 months. I can't remember how long, even though I was in a relatively senior position, was managing that person's most important portfolio. And so for months, I was not able to meet with this person, even though I was doing really important work. And in a sort of weird backhanded way, I took it as a compliment because obviously they didn't fire me. In
Yeah,
a
that's
sense,
very interesting,
yeah,
right?
right.
That's a
It is, yeah, right. But yeah, well, what the f, right? That this person has basically
so
shut
they
you out.
held on to you, shut you out because you wouldn't agree.
Yeah,
It's kind of
yeah.
a weird
Um,
situation, actually.
Yeah, and another experience I had with this particular individual is that when I would go ask for resources that were not going to personally benefit me, but where I thought were critical to the larger mission, that person would saying I was just trying to build up my empire,
Hmm.
which was kind of blew my mind because I'm just like I work for you. I don't know what you're talking about. I work for the organization ultimately, but you're the big boss, and so anything that I do is really just in the service of our larger mission. But the idea that this person would see their employees as competition in some way was another thing that struck me.
Should I imagine
Um,
that's potentially projection, by the way? That, I say, you're just trying to build something up because I would, that's the only person who kind of thinks that all the time is someone who's doing that, right?
yeah, absolutely. I do think it's
Okay.
projection. I
Okay.
think that's a really important point. When we talk about traits of bad leadership, I think that characteristic of projection is really important.
Go on.
On a more general term, I've worked for people who just go around their direct reports to to those individual subordinates without even telling them. I've had situations where my boss's boss is just contacting me directly and telling me to do things.
So it puts you in a bad
Yeah,
spot because you're now being sort of operated by somebody else, and your own boss might get upset by that, right?
yeah, and for the person in the middle, I've also been in the situation where my boss is just going around me to people who report to me, and I'm finding out things that I had no
No
idea.
idea.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think just it breeds chaos and dysfunction within the organization. So this goes under the category of frankly weird. So when I was a junior faculty member, the person I was reporting to came into the computer room, and this was quite a while ago when computers were still not everywhere. There's like a computer room, and I was in the computer room, and this guy comes over, and he's behind me, and he starts clearing his throat, and so I turned around. I'm like, "Oh, hi," and I said him by his name, and then I just kind of and he was, and I didn't quite know what he wanted, and then I suddenly realized that he was edging me out of my seat, like I was sitting in this chair, and he just starts like pushing me out with like his butt. Okay, and suddenly I
Nice.
realized I was literally being removed from my chair so that he could sit at the computer,
But you're being
and
nussed out.
Yeah, and so before I knew it, I was just standing. I would have either fallen off the chair or I would have been like standing there, and this guy had just kind of slid in and was using the computer, and that was that. And so I was like, okay, I left.
This is one
So
of your
anyway,
bosses who
this is one of my
had
bosses. Yeah.
they had the option of using words, right? I mean, like, that is something we teach kids, use your words, you know?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Uh, but that's not what happened here. Do you want one or two more?
Yeah, I do,
Sure,
actually.
sure. All right.
I hate to say it, but I'm loving this. Yeah, and I said that in jest. I
Yeah.
have seen my share
One
of shit
one
shows.
one situation I had, which I think others might identify with, is I worked for somebody who would tell me to go off and do things, and I would go off and do them, and then I'd come back and he would deny that he had told me to do those things, particularly when they didn't seem to be going well. And, with one particular individual, when this happened a few times, I actually went and tracked down somebody who had worked for that individual before me and told them about it, and they're like, "Oh, yeah, 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 no, they do that all the time." So I realized this was just a character issue. And I think one of the general points that I got out of reading Hogan's work, which really resonated for me, is he said leadership incompetence is common, predictable, and largely driven by dysfunctional personality dispositions. He went on to say, we believe failure is more related to having undesirable qualities than lacking desirable ones. And I think this is profound insight because what he's saying is that we're hiring the wrong people. That, this is not about just, oh, we need better leadership development. Nothing wrong with that. It's fine.
Yeah.
It's not just about we're not getting people who have these great leadership qualities. The real issue is that we hire the wrong people. And it struck me when I was thinking about Robert Caro's quote, the author Robert Caro, that it's not so much that power corrupts, it's that power reveals. And I think that what happens when people come into these positions is you start to see that. You start to see the dysfunctional personality dispositions. And Hogan has written a series of papers. I know, Stefan, you've had a chance to look at them.
Yeah,
I don't know if you
and
want to share a
I
little bit
wanna
about
comment
it.
on that. Yeah, so, unfortunately, one of the messages I got from reading this article by Robert Hogan called "20 Years on the Dark Side" is that in this review of the literature, bad often wins over good, and what he means by that is that what kind of destroys the workplace are these sort of alienating characteristics of the leadership rather than the positive and inspiring characteristics of leadership. In fact, in reviewing others' work, he says, look, there have been a lot of efforts to figure out what motivates employees, like little bonuses or pay for performance or whatever it is. The things that seem to really drive employee behavior is toxic leadership. People's big decisions about jobs are heavily driven by who the fuck they don't want to deal with. And I have to admit that has been one of my experiences as well. This I have to get away from this person. Now I'm going to make a big change and go ahead and apply for a fellowship. Not until I was kicked in the pants by the toxicity of others did I have to make decisions. So there's unfortunately a lot of truth to this. And Hogan seems to argue that we really have a weak language for describing these behaviors other than to say, oh my God, as we just did.
Yeah, I think the the reality of working with these various people was not just, as I mentioned, these sort of comic anecdotes, but that they created a culture of fear, a culture where innovation was much less likely. People didn't want to take chances, where collaboration was very, very difficult, where the constant challenge of moving forward was how are we going to deal with this person who has power, rather than how are they going to support us, how are we going to work together. That oftentimes these individuals, their strongest characteristics were that they could manage up well and they could manage well publicly. They put on a good face. And also that they were very quick to detect what they perceived as threats to their power and to suppress that, although many of those were just paranoid concerns on their part. But when it actually came to advancing the mission of the unit or the organization, that was very challenging.
I want to come at this in two different ways. I want to talk about this a little bit as the employee who's dealing with somebody who's toxic or difficult, and I also want to talk about this at a more general level as what it means for medicine. But for a moment, just imagine that I'm a new assistant professor, instructor, resident, and there are toxic people above me. There are people who kick down and kiss up. How do I survive a bad leader if they're kind of abusive?
Well, first of all, that can relate to that. I've had that experience at different stages in my career where I'm dealing with people who exhibit all those characteristics. So
Yeah.
I think you described that well.
And the thing is you're afraid that if you say anything, they're gonna be like, "What? The problem is you, buddy, and I'm gonna write this up or I'm gonna take away a privilege."
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of two thoughts I have. One is a direct answer to your question, which is what do you do? And the larger question I think is why are we hiring these people? What do
Yes,
we
we're
do
gonna
to
come
not
back to
hire
that,
them?
but just for a
Yeah,
moment.
that's right because I think that's something that deserves that's the preventive, right? Is to figure out how
Yeah,
not to hire these people or not to promote them. But I think that when you find yourself in that situation, you ultimately have two choices. And the question, and this is the dilemma: do I leave or do I try to muddle my way through this? Research I've seen shows that about 50% of people have left a job because of a bad boss.
yeah.
But I think in most cases, we're not going to leave. We're going to muddle our way through. How do you do that? And I don't think there's a simple answer to that. And the reason I say that is, but I do think that working for a bad boss takes an incredible emotional toll on us. It can cause burnout, depression, and so forth. And so I'm of the view that if you've decided to stay, I'm speaking personally here, is just to psychologically say, this person is they're an asshole, but I've decided to stay and they're not going to change. And so I'm just going to have to work with what I have, just be very realistic about it. And these are the ways in which I think I can move forward. These are my priorities. It may involve allying yourself with people who can help you. It may involve making modifications to your original plans so that you're working less with that individual. It's like anything else where you've face a puzzle. But I do think that the healthiest thing you can do is to fully acknowledge that the person you're working for is an asshole. I mean, to yourself, not to them. I can take a lot of shit to get to what I want, but it doesn't say anything about how I feel about those who are putting it in my face. So I think that's the mindset that I think you have to adopt if you've decided to stay. It just becomes a pragmatic puzzle. How do I continue to move forward under these circumstances?
One of the things that I probably learned in talking to you many years ago is that if I think the individual I'm dealing with is emotionally exploitative, reactive, or abusive, I don't show them that they have that effect on me.
Absolutely.
So
That's a really
it's
important point.
yeah,
And I don't think there's anything wrong with sucking up to somebody who's narcissistic as long as you recognize that
that's what you're doing.
you don't really respect them, that you are sucking up to them. You're not compromising your values. They want you to go get them coffee. I mean, so what? As long as you're not harming other people, do whatever it takes to stay,
Yeah.
I was going to say on the good side, not that they have a good side, but to avoid the worst of it so that you can continue to move forward, knowing full well that you're just doing what you need to do to get through a tough situation.
And the reason I'm focusing on this is maybe it's generational or maybe it's something that happens at a young in your 20s or whatever. For me, at least as a human, I always wanted to be authentic and I always wanted people to sort of see me as I authentically am and to feel like I might be flawed, but we understand that and we work together on it. And all that stuff has to go out the window.
Yes.
Authenticity uh, basically is a disservice to forming a working relationship with a
Yeah, I think
toxic individual.
authenticity is important when you have a good faith relationship with somebody.
Yeah,
When somebody is interacting with you in good faith, but when they're not interacting in good faith, then authenticity is
a
should be replaced
liability.
with should be replaced with good acting.
So we've now just given a big dose of cynicism to people who probably
I would say
may think,
pragmatism.
oh, okay. Okay. We've just given a big dose of pragmatism for the sort of what do I do if I'm in that situation? But then it leads to the question of is this somehow more common in medicine, this
I doubt
leadership
it.
stuff?
I
Yeah.
doubt
Okay.
it
Okay.
just given the research that I've looked at in the business world where it seems to be overwhelmingly common. They're saying,
Okay.
50 to 75% of people in managerial roles would be probably considered incompetent in the studies that I've looked at, depending on how that's defined. So yeah, no, I
Okay.
don't think
So
it's unique to medicine. As like I said, I think there's something particularly sad about this type of behavior in the healing profession or in the healing professions. When you look at the definition of competence in, say, the business literature on sales, for instance,
Yeah.
a competent leader or a competent manager will increase sales
Yeah.
above the expected norm. Okay, that would be a good leader. Bad leader will bring their sales levels down. So that's mercenary. And if that involves hitting everybody over the head with a baseball bat when they don't make enough sales, then that would be considered good leadership. Now, of course, what the science of leadership is shown in business is that that actually does not get sales up. What gets sales up is they talk a lot about servant leadership, and so it turns out that treating people well does increase their performance, but it's still very instrumental, right? Because it's really about ultimately getting them to sell more widgets. I think what's different, at least in my view, in
Oh, good.
academic medicine, is that it's not just about the ends justifying the means. It's really about creating an environment where the process itself is part of what matters. That we want to create a culture where people can innovate, can grow, can feel safe, and those in themselves are goals.
If the people that we work with are treated merely as objects or as people we use in order to make a number look good, how can we expect those same people to turn around and look at the folks who come to us for care and see them as genuine fellow human beings who they're working with in partnership? Because that's not the experience we're offering the people we work with. And yet we want this something real and healing to occur in the care environment. So I do think the standard might need to be ideally different, and if not, maybe higher in a way for how we choose and build and develop leaders in healthcare.
Yeah, that's you put that beautifully. I think that analogy is really important. We've talked so much about how doctors turn into efficient task completers, where they're in the room with the patient and they're just checking off boxes.
Yeah.
Have you had your colonoscopy, your flu shot? And they're not really engaging with that person, and then they're writing a note, and then they're billing based on all the stuff they did. And I don't want to draw a direct line because I think it would be oversimplify things. But I think you're right that if we create a culture where people can't really grow, learn to communicate effectively, be authentic, then that's the kind of doctor we're more likely to produce.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I do think there's a real connection between bad leadership and, in this case, creating doctors who are more likely to be insecure, closed, and not able to engage.
So why is it that we often bring to the top of the heap folks who aren't really very good leaders? What's how do they get there?
I think there are really two issues here. One is a lot of people are going to turn out to be bad leaders. Hogan talks about people as having these bright qualities and these dark qualities. The person's uh, behavior when they're presenting themselves to the public or to their boss, which is charming and upbeat and positive and so forth, are the bright qualities. And the dark qualities are what they do when they're under stress, when, quote, nobody important is looking, and they become mean and petty and vindictive.
Dismissive.
Exactly. And so he refers to those as the dark qualities. And he says to some extent, all of us have both of those.
Yeah.
But what happens with bad leaders is that those dark qualities become predominant. And I think that's where being the employee, the person who works for the leader, you can see it. In a sense, you could say you're seeing their quote true self. Although I think both of those both the dark and the light are part of a person, but it feels more like that true self when all of a sudden you see the mean side.
And this is where your experience is different because I haven't worked my way up a leadership ladder very high. And so when I look at a president or a dean of a medical school, I don't see him up close and personal. All I know is an email announcement. So I couldn't tell you if there's bad leadership. I mean, according to this theory, I don't get to see what the real quality of the individual is at the highest levels. And sometimes you have had that chance.
Yeah, although I know from our conversations you've experienced those behaviors at lower levels.
Absolutely. My gosh.
Now, all I'm saying is it ain't getting better as you move up. So that's my point. I mean, these people may become more public facing, and maybe and they are probably a little bit more charming and charismatic, but but it's the same stuff. It's the same crap when you're basically their employee when you're working for them, regardless of how elevated their title is. I think that's what I'm getting at here.
And the other thing I've kind of run into on this dark side, bright side thing is that I've been in situations where I worked with leaders where they showed me their best. They gave me their kindest treatment. And I've been very aware that I was watching and observing somebody putting on a show because I could see how they were treating other people, and that the narrative they would tell me that would often be very self-justifying really wasn't lining up with the facts. It's very disconcerting, by the way. It's worse to be on the downside, to be kicked in the teeth by such
Yes.
bosses, but to be their confidant and hear somebody tell you why everything they're doing is right and how they're so misunderstood and why I mean well and I'm to be trusted, it's not very encouraging either. You think, "Oh my goodness, what kind of pathology is going on here that you think I should be entrusted as if with all your best behaviors, and then you don't have those for anyone else." It's a bit odd, but I've seen it
Well,
multiple
yeah, I mean, I
times.
think what happens is that as you become more quote unquote important and powerful within an organization, which of course both of us are because we've been in our organizations for a long time. We're both tenured full professors. We have a lot of privilege. A lot of people in leadership positions may treat us well, but that's not necessarily a reflection of how they would necessarily treat somebody who
Yeah.
they regarded as less powerful and who perhaps works directly for them. And again, I keep coming back to this. You only really know what a person is like when you are their subordinate. And meaning like you literally report to them. They are your boss. That's when you really see it. And I think that's really what we're talking about here. But like I said, I think the bigger issue is that in a sense, while these are all problems unto themselves, they're symptoms that somebody who acts like this is going to be problematic in much bigger ways. They're not exhibiting, they're not likely to exhibit a commitment to the community that they've been charged with serving. And so what you're dealing with is somebody who is focused on their career, on their power, and not on what can I do to make the careers of the people who are part of this community more innovative, more effective, more fulfilling, in a way that advances the overall mission of this, whether it's university, medical school, division, whatever it is. And I think that's why these little anecdotes I'm telling are all, in my view, are always a huge warning sign. In the same way, for instance, somebody who is a sexual harasser, and I've worked for people who I've heard are sexual harassers. I haven't personally seen it, but when I hear that somebody's a sexual harasser, I can't. I know I'm not going to be like, oh well, they're a sexual harasser, but otherwise they're a great leader. Like that, just those two things are not compatible because somebody who treats other people like that, it's a huge symptom. No matter how charismatic they are not going to be healthy, at least for an organization like an academic institution or a medical school. Now, they may be good at helping a large corporation sell widgets. So I can see, again, I haven't lived in the business world, but I could see in the very mercenary environment of Wall Street or the business world, where someone who's a total jerk could actually be good at increasing the bottom line. I don't know. I would be a little more open to that possibility. I still don't think it's healthy, but certainly within academia and medicine, where we're really about healing, I think that it's a complete deal breaker.
Somebody's gonna say, though, but you know what they might be good at is securing competitive grants from the National Institutes of Health, and that there's something
Yep.
potentially mercenary about that, and it's part of how you get promoted, isn't it? That a typical academic institution that we work in will say, if you have grants plus reputation, that's why we should make you our chairman or dean or president.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they might be quite good at that kind of widget.
I think we need to think about that whole set of values. So, as you know, in institutions like medical schools talk a lot about what's our grant funding, how are we doing with our clinical revenue, all of that stuff, rather than what are we doing to create a healing environment for our patients, and ultimately everything should be in the service of healing
Got it.
within a healthcare system and a medical school. And of course, I see that as maybe that's a vision. It's so far reaching, but it's also so obvious. So I think that it's perfectly okay to go after grants. It's perfectly okay to get paid for the services you provide. But when those things become a thing unto themselves, when they become the prize and, more important than anything else. And I do know of people in leadership positions for whom, getting those grant dollars up, if that means hiring a bunch of people who are abhorrent in some way, who've been kicked out of other institutions because, bad behavior. If they got the grants, then they're welcome. And I've seen that happen.
I've
So,
seen it happen. Yeah, somebody's terrible as a human being, but they have the ability to write good grant proposals and kind of keep that going. They just move laterally because they're seen as rainmakers for the next institution that picks them up.
yep, yep.
And
Uh,
that's bad, I guess we're saying, or I mean,
Yeah, I
that
mean, I think
sounds
that's, in a sense, the institution in a sense, you could say it's getting what it deserves. If their value system is that what matters to us more than anything else is the number of dollars that we can say our total NIH budget is, funding is, then yes, you get what you ask for. You will then, if you have leaders that just pursue that at all costs, they can get that number up. And but to me, you don't have a community. You don't have a medical school, as I would see it. So I think it's a question of the values of the organization. And the question is that really the mission statement? Is the mission of the institution? Our mission is to get as much NIH funding as possible, and nothing else matters. I haven't seen a medical school that writes a mission statement that says that. Some of them may behave that way, but I've
they
never
say
seen it in their mission
discovery.
statement.
It's discovery,
Yeah,
service,
yeah,
teaching. It's usually something like that.
yeah,
Improving the
yeah,
world through discovery, service, and teaching. And it's implicit, isn't it? The word discovery implies getting on a top 10 list with NIH grants, I think. Or
yeah.
does it?
And so I think the point that you're getting at here, which I think is a really important one, is that if the true unspoken mission of a medical school is, be damned with all the healing stuff, we just want to get our NIH dollars up, and we put out a nice statement, and we want to get as much clinical revenue as possible, so we'll just provide lots of elite services as a quaternary hospital or whatever. If that's actually the unspoken mission of an organization, and they hire leaders who may be toxic but are really good at those two things, then the institution is getting what it wants. That is not an environment where I would want to spend my time, but that's a value. I don't see that as really what medical education should be like. I don't think that's
Yeah.
the culture of where we want to train the next generation of doctors. I think the point here is sometimes the bad leaders we get are actually maybe just what the institution is looking for. And I can think of examples. I can think of a medical school where they went out and they hired a dean for that very specific purpose, and it was very clear that that's what the dean did and didn't do other stuff. And it paid off in that narrow way. So I think, yes, I think that's one thing, is what the unspoken values are of the institution. But what I think what's also important to talk about is a lot of institutions hire lots of people. They hire department heads and they hire division heads. And I don't think they're sitting down and saying, let's hire a toxic leader, or
No, I
let's
think
hire a
it's
bad leader.
heterogeneous.
Yeah. I mean, I think to put it more simply, I think a lot of search committees are just extremely unsophisticated and just make really bad choices. And I can think of situations where a person who was obviously a failed leader at an institution that I worked at was then hired away to an even higher, more elevated position at another institution, and we're just going, oh my god.
Yep,
And
I've
so
seen
I've
that.
seen that happen a number of times. And I'm sure that search committee wasn't sitting down and saying, "Oh, let's hire somebody who is completely incompetent and toxic." I think they were unsophisticated, and I think it can be very difficult because a lot of these people, as I said, are charismatic.
Let's dive into that because how does charisma or how do we deal with it being not being overwhelmed by charisma? That's what I want to ask.
Sometimes it's very hard, but I do think there can be red flags. So, for instance, I've seen resumes from people who have, I don't know, 400 publications, something, enormous like that, that really impresses people. And then you start to look at it and you realize they just are very good at getting their names on papers. Okay. So there's like, 8, 10, 20 authors, and they always get their name in there. One example was a pathologist. And from what I could tell, every time he read a slide, he somehow got his name on the paper. And the search committees, wow, this person is so productive. And you're like, no, this is somebody who's figured out how to
Get their name
um,
on papers.
get name of papers, which
It's a
is, I wouldn't
warning
call
symptom. The
it's a
point is this
warning
is a
symptom.
warning sign. When you see 400 papers, if it's academic, I mean, you got to at least ask what's really going on here.
Absolutely. I've also seen sometimes when announcements have come out about, "Oh, we just hired so and so, from such and such," and often, by the way, they often feel like they just got a trophy wife, but if this person is so impressive, and then they've written 14 books and so on, and then I'll Google to be like, "Oh, okay," and then I can't find these books. I might find like 3 of them where they wrote a chapter on a manual that interns carry around in their pocket or something, and who knows, maybe some of these books were, quote, unpublished, maybe they were part of a professional organization, but it's like, I don't think so. And so I've
And
seen,
yet
so I think
you've
it's
written actual books. I will attest to the fact that Dr. Wiener has written
not
actual
14,
books,
not
not 14
14.
of them.
You see somebody who is elevated for having written 14 that I can't find anywhere, that makes you cynical. You're just like, wow, this could be fraud, or just gross exaggeration. That makes you think about narcissism, lack of integrity, and so forth. So maybe not doing the search committee, not necessarily doing their homework.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes comes from wishful thinking. They get excited about somebody, they want to believe everything. I've also seen people, by the way, put on their resume grants that they didn't get. They'll have like a list of, 3 pages of grants, and like this one they got, that one they didn't get, this one they got, and it'll say in tiny letters, unfunded. But if you're not looking carefully, you'll be like, oh wow, this person, got all these grants. When in fact, there's no place on, as far as from my perspective, for putting. I mean, I would have an incredibly impressive resume if I listed all the grants I did not get.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I would be stunning, but I
Yeah.
just don't think you do that.
I have been rejected from many of the best journals in the country.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and I just don't so again, to me, that's a big warning sign. Either the person doesn't even understand how you put a resume together, or they're trying to fool people, without literally being dishonest, because it does say in small font, unfunded. So again, I do think that there are ways in which search committees are remarkably unsophisticated. But what I will say though is that, and this is where we probably want to talk a little bit about charisma. Charisma can be
Yes.
seductive, and I think it's important to kind of think a little bit about how you separate out the charisma from the buffoonery,
What
the evidence that
so
the person.
so I'll make the pro case. You need somebody who can turn it on for an audience. You need I say this as a person who really loves turning it on for an audience, but okay. You need somebody who can turn it on for an audience, who can inspire, who can, help people find their passion to do something better. You need someone who could communicate with our stakeholders and help them understand our mission. You need to feel something when you see this individual. So what's wrong, Saul?
So the term charisma is hard to define because can it can be experienced differently by different people. I can think of public figures who some people think are charismatic, and I don't. I don't find them charismatic at all. But I can think of situations where I was duped, quite a few actually, where when I met the person, they said, quote, the right things. They said things that seemed to be genuine, in terms of caring for the things I thought were important, I cared about. They seemed bright, they seemed thoughtful. And then when I started to work for them, these so-called dark side characteristics came out, where all of a sudden I was jolted by their nastiness and their pettiness and so forth. And so I do think that it can be really tough. Hogan has
Yeah.
come up with a series of instruments. He's actually turned it into a big company. And so I can't speak for the success of these instruments, but they're widely used now. The Hogan, what's it called? The Hogan Development Survey. And Hogan actually has several different surveys, which I think are quite widely used now in the business world. And essentially, what he says he's figured out through years of research is a proprietary set of questions that you can administer to candidates for various leadership positions. And the way they answer those questions will be revealing of their actual behavior if they are given that leadership position. It'll predict whether certain dark side characteristics are likely to come out under stress or things like that. It's an intriguing idea, and apparently there is some evidence that it is actually predictive. You always think about somebody trying to game that if they're taking it, but
Yeah.
what Hogan and his organization claim is that it's hard to game. And the reason it's hard to gain is that the person who, for example, is narcissistic or has some of these negative characteristics of exercising control when it's not appropriate, that they will actually answer these questions truthfully because they will think that these are the answers that are the right answers when in fact those types of responses are predictive of troubling behavior later. That's what the claim is. To the extent that that is true, it's a powerful tool for selecting, or at least a part of a resource for selecting people for leadership positions and trying to sort out those who are charismatic but have a dark side that it's going to be a problem versus those who are charismatic and ultimately will do fine. I think one of the things that I've seen in the literature is that there's some people say there's a U shape with charisma, which is that if a person has no charisma but is highly competent, they won't be effective because they just won't have the ability to excite people, build consensus, win people over. If the person is all charisma and lacking a commitment to service to the community, then they're just going to be toxic. And so what you're looking for is somebody in the middle who has enough charisma, but is also using that charisma to advance the organization's mission. And that's obviously what you're looking for. And so the degree to which these self-completed survey questions can tease out those individuals from the ones who are highly charismatic but toxic, I don't know. That's the claim. But I do think that yes, it can sometimes be quite hard to sort out who's who.
I think that when you meet somebody who gets you feeling excited about a topic and you're thinking of working with them seriously, it's worth asking others who have worked with them directly, if you can, what has happened when things have gone wrong? Have they ever owned making a mistake? How have they owned it? Have they ever erred and then corrected the error in a way that made sense to you? What happens when wires get crossed and occasionally there's just a plain old miscommunication? Do they lash out? Do they ignore it? Do they address it? Have you ever had to solve a problem with them? And if I was interviewing such a person, I'd ask some basic questions that anybody would ask you to tell me what you've learned from somebody who worked for you, for instance, because that could get potentially expose the ability to learn from others. I might also ask genuinely, tell me about an actual mistake, a serious mistake. Tell me how it happened and how you addressed it.
Again, I'm not a psychologist who works in this area, but I will say from life experience that charismatic people can answer all those questions, quote, the right way.
Mm,
That they're very good at that. I think I come
okay.
back to this over and over again. The single only way you really know how somebody is as a leader is if you work not with them. You kept saying with. If you work for them and they have to see you as working, you literally report to them. They determine whether you keep your job. They pay your, that's when you find out
So all
what
that other
somebody
stuff they could overcome
they
it, huh?
they can become very good at. Yeah, they're
I
very
think
good
you're
at glossing through that.
I think you're right.
I've yeah. I've been involved in search committees and hiring of people who answer those questions very well. But then when they are in a position of leadership, you start to see the danger signs start to become evident.
Do you think there's something we've left out here that we're not getting at that's important to the domain of thinking about bad leadership?
Yeah. I also have worked for people who I consider to be very good leaders. And one of the things that I've noticed about these good leaders is how low key they are. And in fact, what I've discovered is that when somebody is a good leader, what you notice is not them. You notice that the unit that they are responsible for is a smooth running, it's just a healthy environment where people are coming to work, are comfortable with coming to work and are doing great work. And they may not even be aware that the leader is not somebody who's frightening to them. The
Hmm.
leader may not even be that particularly charismatic. They may not think that much about the leader, but everything seems to work. The job gets done. And I think that's because that leader is not focused on power. They're simply going to work every day and just solving problems and helping make sure that everybody's doing what they should be doing, meaning that it's well aligned with their skill set and expectations, and it's just a quiet environment. It's just a quiet type of competence. And so I think when you go back to this airport bookstore and you see these great leadership type of things, the people who go buy those books are the ones who scare me in a way. They have this romanticized idea they're going to become sort of great leader. I think that the people I've most valued working for are just quietly doing their job, and their job is leadership. But I don't think they see it that way. They see their job as, in the genuine sense, as service. And of course, don't get me wrong, these people are also politically very savvy because whenever you're in a leadership position, there are going to be troublemakers.
Yeah.
There are going to be people within your organization who are interacting with you in bad faith. There are going to be threats. There's going to be competition. All of those things are there. It's just that that person approaches those things pragmatically, strategically, and they're not naive at all. But it's not about them. They're just focused on moving forward, on creating a
Hmm.
collaborative environment, on hearing what others have to say and to offer because they know that that's going to be critical since they don't see themselves as having all the answers. So, I mean, that's the quality. But to me, it almost feels like the absence of the negative characteristics.
I do think we're sometimes in a position to encourage and to develop people like you just described. I see a resident or a student who gets stuff done and is quietly doing that and helping others do their work. We need to acknowledge that that's a crucial element of what you just described and tell them
Yeah,
so.
and glad you brought that up because leadership development is a really important topic. And I think one thing that people often don't say enough about is that in an unhealthy organization, you're less likely to see the advancement of future good leaders. Because in an unhealthy organization, there are people who are doing the hiring, who are in relatively powerful positions themselves, are more focused on like, protecting their little domain. You know, don't anybody touch my cheese, as I think the saying goes. And so they're going to hire people who they judge are going to defend the status quo, not mess with their turf and so forth. And so I think once an organization has become an unhealthy environment, and I think this is probably true for a lot of organizations, including medical schools and health systems, the most promising individuals may be less likely to advance. On the other hand, if you have a more healthy organization, then you're more likely to see that they're genuinely going to elevate people who show that they're pragmatic, maybe not incredibly charismatic, but they're hardworking, they're fair, they're willing to make decisions. Those are the people who are more likely to advance. I would say that leaders in general are not necessarily innovators. I would say that good leaders are supportive of innovation.
Hmm.
They create an environment that feels safe and supportive and open to innovation.
We have to acknowledge that somebody might hear this and have a perspective informed by Silicon Valley and the rise of sort of technological dictators who speak of disruptive innovation, move along with me or get out. I all I can say right now is I don't think this is the ideal for healthcare delivery.
Exactly. When you go and look at the business literature, they define effective leadership in terms of dollars and cents. Is this person increasing the shareholder value of the company? And in a purely capitalist environment, I guess that would be the definition of good leadership. But I think in healthcare organizations and in medical schools, as we said, the ends do not justify the means, and that we have to give as much thought in how we value leadership by the process as well as by where that leader takes you. And I also would say that because healthcare institutions should be fundamentally, as I see it, about advancing the healing mission. Ultimately, it all boils down to do we create a, a, a better place for being a patient, a better place for producing doctors who are going to be wonderful and care for patients well. That is not compatible with what Silicon Valley might define as a good leader necessarily.
A potential impediment to encouraging what you've just described in healthcare organizations is the board of directors or the board of trustees for a medical school or a large healthcare organization. The types of folks who are typically chosen to become trustees are going to be political allies of power. The types of people who are going to be invited to join a board of directors for an institution very often will have achieved something that's seen as a typical coin of the realm. Maybe they led something else in the past that might have been quite toxic, but because they led it and their name was on it, they're going to be asked to be on the board of directors. So I think we have to recognize that the leaders of the leaders are themselves potentially a challenge here.
Well, certainly when you get to the highest levels of hiring, the board of trustees becomes important. But in most cases, they're a rubber stamp. So a board of trustees is not involved in hiring a division head or a department head or even a dean. It gets to them and they sign off on it. And if there's some huge red flag, I think it would be very rare for a board of trustees. And we have seen that in the most recent situation that we are politically in the country right now, where there have been boards of trustees who have gotten involved in leadership decisions where that was typically never done in academia because of very high level, presidential level politics. But I would say that the board of trustees, at least in my view, is not generally that involved in the
Okay.
decisions of most of the people hired within a medical school.
Okay.
But I think the last thing I want to say on this is, what are the consequences, in addition to this unpleasant environment, the lack of supportive healing characteristics that you see with these individuals? Well, one of them is, I would say, almost always a lack of transparency. I find that these individuals in general hold their cards tight. They're all kind of control freaks. So they may act like they're very open. They may bring together the faculty, for instance, to do a strategic planning process, and everybody feels like
Mm.
they're super involved in everything. But I always notice that they never attach any dollars to the
To the
so-called
discussion.
priorities.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the discussion. They just go off and do this, and the department heads and the faculty all spend months and so forth. You end up with this strategic plan, but then ultimately the decisions about how funds are spent just sort of seem to happen, and they happen in a very very small room with maybe that leader and maybe a finance person and a few other people. And so I think lack of transparency is a major consequence. I would say that another major consequence is that everything becomes about power within these relationships. That you're working with people who are very conscious of their power, hanging on to their power. Who has the nicer office? How many people work for you, and that's coming from the top as well,
Hmm.
as opposed to, we're all here to do good work,
Mm.
and we're all here to listen to each other. So these have huge ramifications for the organization.
People run away or they
Well,
stay.
people run away, or the organization just is not, it's always reactive. It's always responding to problems. Oh, you need to balance your budget, but it's not forward thinking. It's not,
Yeah.
there's nothing novel happening. Everything is all about putting out fires. And I think that's, that again, that's something that's very common when you have that kind of leadership.
So that is a potentially downward looking note. And yet I think the stories that you've told are pretty important for as a kind of tonic for the work that we do.
One reality of the conversation we've had is that I don't think I have come up, I'm speaking personally, with an entire solution to this problem. I think that it's very hard to
Yeah.
consistently hire people, particularly when they're coming from outside the organization, who are just not going to have these characteristics. I think there are things you can do to mitigate that. As I said, like, don't be a fool when you're on a search committee in terms of the kind of oversights that we talked about, and obviously, check references, talk to their subordinates, but it can be so hard to do that. We all know that those subordinates often don't want to talk because they're not sure the person's going to leave. They may be fearful. They may not share what they want. Maybe they want to get rid of the person, so they're going to say positive things about them. So I think I have to acknowledge that
We don't have a full solution.
there's not an
Yeah.
obvious solution to this problem of bad leadership. But I do think that it's, at least in my view, it's important to talk about it because it has such a profound effect
Yeah.
on the organizations that we love and work for and are part of.
Well, Saul, I want to thank you for sharing your experience with us and, in this case, helping us call it like it is. I think that's an important service.
Thanks, Stefan. We hope you've enjoyed this latest episode of On Becoming a Healer. If you have and you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so now. Also, please rate us on the Apple Podcast app, as it will help others find us. And if you have a few moments, leave a review. In addition, if you'd like to make a comment about this episode, we'd love to hear from you. There are a couple ways to do that. If you're using the Apple Podcast app, then just open the episode website link and enter your comment there. Or you can directly go to the website contextualizingcare.org, select the podcast tab, and then scroll down and click on the episode. There you'll find the same comment box. Finally, you can always reach us at onbecomingahealer@gmail.com.